here.
So thanks, Phil, for having me back. It can't have been too bad the first time. And thank you for sticking around to watch. I'm going to get to the point where I'm talking about this paper at the bottom about entangled pedagogy, but I want to start the story in 2007 when I joined the University of Edinburgh as an e-learning developer, and I didn't really understand what that meant. And I didn't really understand what e-learning was or when it happens. Have I stopped sharing my screen? I think I have. Right, sorry. So I didn't really understand what counts as e-learning. Why is it e-learning when the learning is not electronic? It's kind of beyond the technology. And also what counts as e-learning? Is it a method? Is it a mode? When classroom teachers are using PowerPoint, does that count as e-learning? When students go home and look stuff up and use the computers after class, does that count as e-learning? What are the boundaries? And also, if you think about purely online learning, aren't there still physical bodies and physical rooms and spatial configurations and hardware and infrastructure and emotions and social dynamics? So it was really difficult for me to kind of bound this idea of e-learning. And fast forward 10 years, I wrote a paper for Post-Digital Science and Education about post-digital education, which is really just saying whenever there's something digital, it's also social and material, and it's also always embedded in complex contexts, and that those contexts matter. So I think there we go. The simplest way of thinking about this is that it is kind of a rejection when people start talking about the separation of technology and pedagogy, which I think that it's often exemplified by people worrying about technology driving education and responding that by saying pedagogy must drive technology, pedagogy must come first. So what I want to do is I want to reject this metaphor of the pedagogical horse being able to drive the technological cart, or of one of these elements being able to come first and the second one being able to come later. To borrow a different metaphor of dance from John Dron and Terry Anderson, where pedagogy and technology are dancing together, that neither is driving or leading the other, they're entangled in this dance. But where John Dron and Terry Anderson suggested that pedagogy and technology were dancing together, I want to say that technology is part of pedagogy. Pedagogy is a broader concept for me, and that technology is dancing with methods and with purposes and values and context. So I'm just going to take you through what is the main diagram in this paper, bit by bit, so that I can kind of slowly explain to you the different elements that I see happening. And if I'm stumbling, it's because I can't see anybody's face at the moment. So normally there's someone at least looking at me so I can tell that I am still listening. Okay, that I can be heard. Great, thanks, Phil. So I'm not just talking to myself, that's good. Right, so the idea of technology driving pedagogy is that someone might say, I'm going to bring in a technological solution to an educational problem, and that it's the technology that will solve that problem. So the skill that teachers have is really just choosing the right tools and using them correctly. In which case, the outcomes for the students can be predicted by the tools that are used. And the teacher doesn't have very much agency because it's the tool, it's the technology that creates the difference. And so as long as the teacher does it right, it'll be fine. And the teacher's agency is only in terms of doing it right or not. So this is either an essentialist view of technology where the technology is embodied with pedagogical principles. So learning analytics will personalize education, for example, or it might be an instrumental concept of technology where technology is neutral, but it can be used to enhance or make more efficient a teaching process. So these, to me, that does have values, but they're invisible values of efficiency and effectiveness. technological determinism means that technology is the thing that drives change rather than the people or some combination of technology and people. So, in response to this worry that many of us have, some people, and I'm glad nobody has said this in the session today because that might have been a bit awkward for me, but many people say it has to be pedagogy first. Pedagogy has to drive technology. And I'm very sympathetic to that idea, but I worry that it doesn't quite work like that. So to break this down, if pedagogy is what drives technology, then the skill is really about choosing the methods and using the tools to enact a pedagogy, which means that the skill of the teacher and the combination of that and the methods can predict the outcomes, and that the teacher has quite a lot of agency. The teacher is in control of what is going to happen, in control of the educational activity to a large extent. And to me, this is a conception of technology, an instrumentalist conception of technology, where the teacher can use whatever technology is available to achieve the teacher's objectives. And I characterize this as a form of pedagogical determinism, which is related to the concepts elsewhere of use determinism and human determinism, which is basically that educators or people are what drives change, and technologies are just a neutral means to help them do that. So the digression to post-digital education in design and practice, that paper I mentioned before, is that technology can't really be separated from social and material activity. It's always, any technology is integrated into a complex context. It can't steamroller over everything that's already there. So technology can't drive pedagogy because there's already pedagogy there. There are already entrenched methods. There are already people and their values in the context in which you bring in technology. Pedagogy can't drive technology because technology is already there. There's already an infrastructure. There are other technologies in play already that are shaping the activity. So you can't just steamroller over all of the technological infrastructure and practices that are already in place via technology. So what I think happens is a mutual shaping of purpose, context, values, methods, and technology. So the purposes, there are always multiple purposes in play of the teachers and of students and other stakeholders. There is a lot of contextual elements about the discipline, the conditions of the students, and we've seen in the pandemic how important those can be. The different values of different members of an institution, including teachers and students, but also learning technologists and librarians and managers and IT support, etc. The methods, the teaching methods that are being used and the technology that's in play. The skill here is for everyone to configure and design and orchestrate practices. And outcomes aren't easily predicted in advance because they're contingent on these complex relations. So nobody has full agency. Agency is always relational, and it's negotiated between elements. So a teacher's agency is relational to the technology and the students and the policy and the infrastructure, etc. And technology is never one thing. It's always an assembly of multiple technologies that are in play. It's always understood as embedded in a context, and it's always relational in the sense that you can't really isolate it from what's actually happening with that technology in a given situation. And this is what I call entangled pedagogy. So pedagogy is this entanglement, for me, of purpose, context, values, methods, and technology, and it's somewhat emergent, and it's difficult to predict outcomes because of this emergent complexity. So I say that the idea that technology can drive pedagogy is an illusion, and the idea that pedagogy can drive technology is an illusion, because in actual fact, you always have inevitably this mutual shaping of different elements in play. So for that reason, I have an aspirational column, which is what can we do? So I think that technology and methods are often emphasized in discourse over purpose. What is it we're trying to do and why? Values, what do we think is important here? Context, who are we teaching and what are the kind of conditions in which we're teaching, etc. So I think aspirationally, we should try to revisit purpose, context, and values as much as possible, recognizing the shaping influence of technology and methods. I also think that this is most easily done when teachers and students and others collaborate on design and practice, because of this negotiation of agency and because of the kind of emergent complex relational aspects of all of these elements. And I think if we're honest, we need to embrace uncertainty. We need to recognize that we don't know exactly, we can't guarantee what's going to happen. Nothing can be perfect in this kind of relational complexity. We want to be open and honest with each other in order to help these negotiations. And instead of talking about skill, I'm talking about knowledge as distributed, because the knowledge that we need for doing a good job of this entangled pedagogy is that teachers and students and other stakeholders need to kind of know things and work together. I've put in that it's ethical because the ethics of technology are not just about the linear effects of what happens, but the tracing of these relations to the side effects and implications that aren't easily visible, and that we need to be responsive to what's actually happening. So I think I will leave it there, so that there's like a small amount of time for questions.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, it's really interesting. There's been a lot of people agreeing with your comments in the chat, so that's certainly, I think, a sign that you're certainly on the right tracks there. Does anyone have any questions for Tim? If you do, would you have to raise your hand, please? Stefano, let me just give you presenter permission, Stefano. You should be able to unmute your mic.
Yes, you're spared my vision. Thank you for your presentation. That point you made about ethics is something that really struck a chord, because it cuts across these so-called digital accessibility and accessibility divide. There are people who can't rely on technology in the same way, but it also sort of how the information is presented and how accessible or otherwise it is to everybody. So that's something that I think sometimes can be missed in the technological approach of driven approaches, and it can be a solution but can also be a barrier. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I think in light of the fact that it's difficult to know in advance what will happen, what the activity will look like, it's important to then talk to the stakeholders, such as students, about what is it actually like for them, rather than assuming that we know in advance. And so communication is a huge part of the ethics of technology, to find out what are the, how are you experiencing this combination of methods and technology and other things.
I was actually referring to the fact that some technology is not accessible to some people, and if we don't use universal design principles.
Yeah, so I mean, outside of entangled pedagogy, I think that's really important. I'm just trying to think about how it relates to the entanglement of things. I think it's the fact that it's part of the context, isn't it? Some students do have accessibility challenges with the usual forms in which we do things. So understanding more about the context of our students will help us recognize the importance of making things accessible. And I think very quickly you would find that every single cohort has accessibility issues that need to be addressed. But if we don't look into that, if we don't interrogate that context, then it's very easy for us to say, oh, it doesn't really matter if our PDFs are not accessible.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks, Tim. Unfortunately, that's taken us to time. So if anyone doesn't have any other questions, can you please stick them in the chat? And Tim, if you have a moment, if you could take a look, that would be brilliant. But thank you, Tim. That was another brilliant presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.